Hi, this is Evan here, Molendinarius from latinum.org.uk, and this is going to be a bit of a rave lesson on how to not learn Latin. The thing is, if you want to learn Latin, well, there's a very comforting way of doing it, and that's by memorizing lists of declension endings and memorizing verb tables and memorizing lots of little bits and pieces. It's like taking the manual for a car and memorizing the sequences of things in various aspects of the technical instructions of the car manual. When you learn to drive a car, you don't need that. You get behind the wheel and you learn how things work and you start driving, and slowly you build up your skill. The same thing. When you want to learn how to ride a bicycle, you get on that bicycle and you fall off lots of times until eventually wobbling away, eventually off you ride, and very, very soon you get used to it and you're riding a bike and you don't think about it anymore. So the question is, how on earth do we learn Latin, or any other language for that matter? If you look at any modern language book, you're learning French or German or Italian or whatever, yes, there will be some grammar there, but there will not be very much. In the beginning, what you're actually learning are sentences, little dialogues, little bits and pieces here and there with a bit of grammar thrown in. But where does the learning come from? Does it come from the grammar, which then creates the language in your head? Or is it the other way around, that you know the language and then you apply the grammar back to it after you know it? So there were a large number of people in the time when Latin was still a workhorse language, so to speak, who had this view that you learned from the Latin. Yes, the grammar was very important, but if you look at the grammars that students were studying back in the 1600s and 1700s, they were extremely abbreviated. So abbreviated they couldn't have actually learned how to speak or use Latin from them. So how come they then knew a lot of Latin? The reason why they knew a lot of Latin was that they were using it all the time. So to begin with, they knew very little vocabulary, only a small amount, but the teacher was asking questions in Latin, examining them in Latin, asking about what limited grammar they knew in Latin. And they were also reading a lot and hearing a lot. If you look at the regulations for various schools in England up to the early 1700s, you were not allowed to speak English in the school grounds. So you went to school, you went to grammar school, you went to school like Harrow or St. Paul's or another school similar to that, a Dulwich Grammar School, whatever it was. You arrived there, and when you walked in the door, you were no longer in English-speaking territory. So even if your language skills were very poor, you were forced to stumble through in your crappy, bad Latin and not speak English. The reason why you had to do this was that when you left your grammar school and you went into one of the learned professions like law or medicine or whatever and studied later on, you had to know Latin. If you went to Oxford or Cambridge, or you decided to go to a university in Europe, then you would go and you would speak to your fellow students in Heidelberg or in Amsterdam or in Madrid, as the case may be, in Latin. That's the language you would have used to communicate with foreign students. And there was a large movement, of course, of students backwards and forwards between the different universities in Europe because you had this common tongue. But back to the issue. How do you learn? So there are a few textbooks that attempt to emulate this. Jean Manesca talked about constructing a Latin textbook along these lines, an explicit one. Prendergast did something like that, and his Latin Mastery series accomplishes this goal, although it's very structured, very dry, very difficult if you're doing it alone. You learn the language through the language. Now, if you look at YouTube, you will see that some of the most popular Latin sites are those that are teaching the grammar. Grammar is very comfortable. It's like breakfast cereal or, like Twinkies or something like that. It's sort of comfort food. It makes you believe that you know something. Ah, I know the first declension. Ah, I know the second declension. Ah, I've learned the endings of this verb. And you feel like you know something when actually you know nothing at all. Nothing. Somebody who can speak a bit of Latin but doesn't know the rules is in a far better place. It's very difficult to learn Latin from analogy. You learn it from exposure to the texts itself. And then up here, you build up the structure of a language. Yes, it's important to know the grammar rules if you want to write Latin correctly. But even those rules are simplifications of the way the Romans themselves used Latin. In the 1700s and 1800s, grammars were written to help students write Latin, and they extracted rules out from the surviving texts of the Romans and often simplified things down and standardized them so that we have a sort of Neo-Latin that's represented in these grammar textbooks that helps us create a standard Latin that would be acceptable across the board, with the main focus on the language use of Cicero in these grammars. But there's lots of other language use by the Romans that's not Ciceronian. And it's not incorrect Latin, it's just different Latin. So the question is, if you're going to read Cicero exclusively and only expose yourself to his language use, then you'll end up with patterns that are similar to his. If you start reading lots of other authors, then you'll have a different type of Latin in your head. It won't come from learning rules and paradigms and things like that. Teachers love them because they're testable. It's much, much easier to test someone's knowledge of verb endings and declensions than someone's actual ability to operate in the language. So what do you do? Well, yes, you have to learn a bit of that stuff. It's important. But far, far more important is to listen to a large amount of Latin, read a large amount of Latin, and try to generate large amounts of Latin. Now, in terms of the generating the Latin, that's a hard thing to do for a beginner. If you go and look at Prendergast's Oral Latin Mastery at latinum.org.uk, you will find there a series of exercises designed for oral Latin composition, very, very clearly structured to help you with your Latin. The Adler Latin course does a similar thing, and there are many, many other types of courses available. If you're learning Latin in a textbook, even if you're learning using a school textbook, set yourself the goal of looking at the English and trying to generate the Latin, and not the other way around. Force yourself to compose in Latin. So when you are learning, for example, in the Cambridge Latin course, go from English to Latin. Go from Latin to English too, but force yourself to go from English to Latin and do it every single day. And do it out loud, orally. Then check your oral Latinity against the model that's in your textbook. And you'll find that you will improve dramatically far, far faster than if you spent time just memorizing paradigms and verb tables and things like that. You can know the grammar of Latin perfectly and know no Latin whatsoever. Where somebody can actually have an intuitive knowledge of Latin and not know very much grammar. Just like somebody in Roman times was speaking in the street would have known how to speak the language correctly pretty much most of the time through exposure to it, but may not have had so much formal grammar. The grammar is important there sort of to check you, but the grammar comes in after you've learned the language. So in Prendergast, he says, well, you first learn the language and then you go back and you read a very abbreviated Latin grammar. But you only do that after you've learned the language. Sound counterintuitive? To my mind, not really counterintuitive, but it's not the way Latin's been taught for a long time. And if you want to be good at it, you need to use it. You need to speak it, you need to absorb it, you need to read it, you need to write in it. And then you will become better at it. That's all for my little rave about Latin. Voila, bye.